The people of Israel, when they had no leader, turned away from God, and so God allowed their enemies to rule over them. For 7 years the Midianites caused them great suffering, and there was very little food to eat. The Israelites called to God, "Please save us." And so God chose Gideon to lead the Israelite soldiers into battle against the Midianites. The Midianites were defeated, and the land was at peace again. After Gideon died, the people of Israel did as they had so many times before. They chose to ignore God's laws. God allowed the Philistine tribe to rule over the Israelites for 40 years. At that time, there was a couple who wanted a baby very badly. One day the woman was alone, and the Lord's angel appeared to her and said, "Soon you will become pregnant and have a baby boy. This baby will be special, dedicated to God from the very beginning. While you are pregnant, you must not drink any wine or eat anything which goes against God's laws. When the baby is born, he must never have his hair cut." The woman nodded. She felt like jumping for joy at the idea of having a baby. But when she heard the angel's next words, she became even more amazed. "This boy will be used by God to help drive the Philistines away from the people of Israel." The woman picked up her long skirts and ran home as fast as she could. When she found her husband, she was so out of breath she could hardly talk. The woman told her husband, Manoah, the whole story. When she had finished, Manoah prayed to God. "Lord, please let the man of God that you sent come back again. Please let him tell us what this plan for the life of our son really is." The Lord did what Manoah asked and sent the angel back. When the angel came back, Manoah asked his question. "Please, sir, what has the Lord planned for our son?" The angel said, "Your wife must be sure to do everything I have told her. She must not drink any wine, she must eat healthy food, and she must not cut the boy's hair." The couple offered a sacrifice, and when the angel disappeared in the fire which went up into the sky, Manoah and his wife were sure he was an angel. The woman did all that the angel had told her. She did become pregnant. Almost a year later she gave birth to a baby boy. They called him Samson. Manoah and his wife brought him up well and didn't cut his hair. That was a sign that he belonged to God. They taught him to worship God and obey his laws. God blessed the boy. He had a special plan for the life of Samson. As Samson grew older, the Lord sent his spirit to teach Samson what was right and wrong. God's spirit also began to strengthen him. One day, when Samson had grown into a young man, he was walking to a village where many Philistines lived. His girlfriend lived there. Samson thought she was very beautiful. He loved her and wanted to make her his wife. When he told his parents that he wanted to marry her, his parents said, "But she's not from Israel. Are you sure she's the right girl? She's from an enemy tribe. You know God has special plans for you. Are you absolutely sure you want to marry this girl?" Samson was sure. He thought she was the loveliest girl he had ever seen, and he was head over heels in love with her. Samson's parents didn't know that this girl was part of God's plan for Samson. It was to help Samson fight the Philistines, and falling in love with this girl was the first step. Samson and his parents went to the girl's village to make arrangements for the marriage. As Samson was following his parents, He walked through a field and heard a strange sound. "What's that?" he wondered. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a young lion appeared. The lion's teeth shone as he opened his mouth and roared. Samson had no weapons at all, but the power of the Lord made him strong, and he killed the lion with his bare hands. Samson carried on with his journey and didn't tell his parents what had happened to him. One day, just before Samson was to marry the girl, he passed the place where he'd killed the lion. There was a swarm of bees on it making honey. He went over to the lion and tasted the honey. It was very sweet. When Samson arrived at his girlfriend's house, he invited the Philistine men to a party. He wanted to get to know them, even though the Philistines were enemies, because he was marrying into their tribe. On the night of the party, about 30 young men sat around fires until late at night, telling stories and drinking. Then Samson said, "Let me ask you a riddle. I'll bet each one of you a piece of fine linen and a change of fine clothes that you can't tell me what it means before the 7 days of the wedding feast are over." "Tell us your riddle," they said. "Let's hear it." Samson said, "This is the riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." The 30 Philistines all looked at each other. "What does it mean?" they asked. The wedding took place, and 4 days of feasting passed. The 30 Philistines couldn't work out the answer to the riddle, but they didn't want to pay for all the clothes they would need to buy for Samson if they lost. So they went to Samson's wife. "Get Samson to tell you the answer to the riddle, or we'll burn down your father's house and kill him and you. You two invited us so that you could rob us, didn't you?" The girl was very scared. She begged Samson to tell her the answer. Day after day she nagged and cried, whined and pleaded. The party was spoiled for Samson because his bride was so miserable. Finally Samson gave in and told his bride the answer. She told the Philistines, and they told Samson. But Samson was so angry that they used his new wife to trick him, that he went to another Philistine village and killed 30 men, stealing their clothes. And those were the clothes he used to pay the 30 Philistines back. After that, he went back home, furious about what had happened. His wife was given to the man who'd been his best man at the wedding. When Samson heard this, he was even more furious. Samson and the Philistines hurt each other again and again, until eventually the Philistines killed Samson's wife. When the Philistines started killing other Israelites, Samson let himself be handed over to the enemy by his friends, as they blamed him for causing trouble. They tied him up with rope and brought him to the Philistines. Suddenly the power of the Lord made Samson strong, and he broke the rope that bound him. He became amazingly strong, just as he was when he'd killed the lion. Samson killed many of the Philistines on that day. For the next 20 years, the Philistines left Samson alone. They knew better than to fight with someone as strong as Samson. Samson became a judge over Israel and learned how to be wise with the help of God's Spirit. While Samson was a judge in Israel, he taught the people how to worship God and obey his laws. Throughout that time, the Spirit of God helped Samson to be very strong. He became famous for his muscles. Samson could lift a heavy city gate. With the Lord's help, Samson could do anything. The Philistines still wanted to capture Samson. They'd never forgiven him for all the destruction he'd caused 20 years earlier, but they were afraid to hurt him. because he was so strong. One day, after many years, Samson fell in love again. The woman he loved was called Delilah, but she wasn't good to Samson. She made a deal with the Philistines and agreed to trick Samson so that she could hand him over to them. Over and over again, she nagged Samson. Why strong? What's your secret? Samson wouldn't tell her. He didn't like being nagged. He tried to ignore Delilah. Then he told her things which weren't true. If I were tied up in wet ropes, I'd lose my strength, he said. Delilah tied Samson up with wet ropes and shouted, Samson, the Philistines are coming. It did no good. He broke free. Again she nagged him, and he said, tie me with new ropes and I'll become weak. Delilah tried that too, but once again Samson broke free. Delilah still pestered him. Plait my hair, he said, hoping Delilah would stop pestering him. Plait my hair, and I'll become weak like other men. Delilah plaited his hair, then called in the Philistines. But Samson was still too strong for them. Please, please, Samson, tell me your secret, Delilah asked Samson morning, noon, and night. She would not give up. Finally, Samson couldn't stand it any longer. All right, woman, he bellowed. I've had enough. The secret of my strength is the Lord. He makes me strong as long as my hair isn't cut. Ever since I was a baby, my parents knew God had a plan for me and promised that I would be specially dedicated to God and not have my hair cut. That night, Delilah called the Philistines again. She lulled Samson to sleep on her lap and then called for a man to cut his hair. When Samson woke up, it was too late. He was too weak to fight the Philistines. They took Samson prisoner and paid Delilah with 5,500 pieces of silver. When the Philistines dragged Samson away, they were very happy. After 20 years, they had captured the strong Samson, who was not strong now. All we had to do was cut your hair, and now you're as weak as a baby, they teased him. The Philistines were very cruel. They tortured Samson, and they blinded him. Then they threw him into prison. The Philistines wrapped Samson in chains and forced him to work, grinding at the mill in the prison. Samson was a prisoner with no hope of escaping. But after some time, his hair started to grow again. Little by little, he felt the Lord giving him back his strength. With each month that Samson spent in prison, he became stronger. One day, the Philistines were having a party in a huge hall. There were about 3,000 people there. Let's have Samson at the party too, they said. Yeah, we can laugh at him. Samson, who thought he was so strong, bring him to us, the people called. The prison guard brought Samson to them. As Samson entered the hall, he heard the crowd and knew that many of the important Philistine leaders were there. He heard them making fun of him, but all he could think was, Lord, help me to be strong. The people ordered Samson to stand between two pillars that held the big house up. Samson asked the boy who was leading him, let me touch the pillars that hold up the building. I want to lean on them. Samson felt the rough stone beneath his fingers. Lord God Almighty, he prayed, please give me back my strength just this once. so that I can get even with the Philistines. Please, Lord, help me." The Lord heard Samson, and his spirit gave Samson strength. He pushed with all his might, and the buildings started to fall. The Philistines screamed, "Earthquake!" But it was no earthquake. "Let me die with the Philistines!" Samson shouted. He pushed again with all his strength, and the house fell on top of them all. His brothers and the rest of his family came and took away his body to bury him. He had led Israel for 20 years, and God had been with him. Many people in Israel were ignoring God's laws at this time, but some people remembered to teach their children to love God. They lived in the way that God wanted, obeying the laws God had given to Moses. One such person was a woman called Naomi. She was married and had 2 sons whom she loved very much. Because there was a famine where they lived, a time when there wasn't much food, the family moved away from where the other tribes of Israel were living. Then her husband died, and Naomi was very sad. Naomi brought up her boys well, teaching them about the Lord. When they grew up, her sons married. The girls they married were not people of Israel, but belonged instead to the Moabite tribe, who had been enemies of Israel for many years. Yet Naomi loved these girls as if they were her own daughters. Then the 2 sons died, and Naomi and the 2 young wives were left alone. It was a very sad time for the 3 women, as they missed their husbands very much. The wives were called Orpah and Ruth. They lived with Naomi, helping her as much as they could. Some time later, Naomi heard that the famine in Judah, her home, was over. God had given them a good harvest. So Naomi decided it was time to return home with her daughters-in-law. They were on their way when Naomi said, "My daughters, my people were one of the tribes of Israel, and it's right that I go back there now. But it would be better for you to go back to your own parents. They will take care of you, and perhaps you will even find husbands again." Naomi was very upset because her sons were dead, and to send away their wives would be like losing her daughters as well. The young women said, "No, no, we will stay with you." But Naomi wouldn't hear of it. "What will you do? I'm too old to find another husband, and even if I could, would you wait 20 years until any sons I had were old enough to marry you? Oh, don't be silly. Go back home, where you can find some men to care for you." Naomi wanted the best for her daughters-in-law. The 2 young women loved their mother-in-law very much. She had been like a mother to them both. "Please, will you let us stay with you?" they asked. "No, go back to your families," Naomi said. She wished they would go away quickly. She loved them so much it was very hard to tell them to go. Naomi felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Orpah. "I will do what you wish and go back to my parents," she said. Naomi hugged her, and they cried together, knowing that they would never see each other again. Orpah gathered her things and left. When Orpah had gone, Naomi said, "Your sister-in-law has gone back to her family, and you should do the same." But Ruth didn't want to leave Naomi and answered, "Please, don't ask me to leave you. Let me go with you. I will go where you go. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Ruth knew about the one true God, even though she wasn't an Israelite. Her husband, Naomi's son, had taught her about God, and she trusted him. Please, Naomi, Ruth begged. I never want to be far away from you. God will take care of us. When Naomi saw how determined Ruth was, she held out her arms and the girl came and hugged her. They would stay together. Naomi and Ruth set out for Bethlehem, where Naomi had grown up. When they arrived, all the elder people remembered Naomi. Old friends hugged her, and the word soon spread. Naomi has come back home, and she's brought her daughter-in-law with her. But all Naomi could think of was how happy she'd been when she left Bethlehem as a young bride. Now she was returning, but without her husband and sons. She felt sorry for herself. Don't call me Naomi, she said. That means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. The Lord has taken so much away from me. I am bitter now. Ruth said nothing, although she still felt very sad about her husband's death. She held Naomi's hand and hoped she would be able to help Naomi get over her bitterness. The barley harvest was just beginning when Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, and Ruth decided to go and find food. I'll go out into the fields and see if there is any barley left over, then bring it home, she said to Naomi. I'm sure to find someone who will let me work with him. Naomi nodded. You do that, my daughter, she said. It was part of Hebrew law that when taking in the harvest, the reapers should leave some for the poor to collect. This was one of the laws God had given to the Israelites to make sure that everyone had enough to eat, and that people shared and cared for each other. It so happened that Ruth went to a field owned by a rich man called Boaz. Boaz was from Bethlehem, just like Naomi. In fact, they were part of the same family. When Boaz came to the field to watch the workers, he saw Ruth and asked a servant who she was. Boaz was a good man who loved and thanked God for the many ways in which God provided for him. When the servant told Boaz who Ruth was and how loyal she was to Naomi, he wanted to help. He called her to him. Please, sir, Ruth said, may I pick up any barley which your servants leave behind? Certainly, certainly, Boaz said. I've heard how good you've been to your mother-in-law, and I'll help you in any way I can. Work in this field with the women here, and stay with them. When you're thirsty, you can drink from their water jars. You are so kind to me, Ruth said. Even though I'm not equal to your servants, you have cared for me and made me feel better. When it was time to eat, Boaz asked Ruth to join him and the other workers. After the meal, Ruth still had some food left, so she saved it to take home for Naomi. Then she went back into the fields, and Boaz turned to his workers. Let Ruth pick up the corn, even where the bundles are lying, he said, and leave some specially for her. The workers did what Boaz said, and by the end of the day, Ruth had gathered a full basket of barley. That was more than enough for her and Naomi. She brought the basket home that evening, together with the food she'd saved from the meal. Ruth, Naomi said, where did you find so much food? Oh, Naomi, I met a man who was so kind and good, Ruth said. His name is Boaz. He helped me and said I can come and gather leftover corn in his fields whenever I want to. Then, for the first time in many months, Naomi felt happier and smiled. Ruth, Naomi said, Boaz is a member of my family. He's my relative. And if he's taking care of us, then all should be well. The two women sat down to eat and thanked God for taking such good care of them. For the rest of the barley harvest, Ruth worked hard in Boaz's fields. She always came home with more food than she needed, and Boaz continued to be kind to her. One day, near the end of the harvest, Naomi said to Ruth, "Ruth, you're young and you need a home of your own. We need to find you a husband. I have a plan. Now, do what I tell you." It was the custom in those days, when a woman had lost her husband, for her nearest relative to marry her. Boaz was the nearest relative of Ruth, and Naomi could see that he cared for her. So Ruth agreed to Naomi's plan. That evening, Ruth got out her best clothes. She washed, put on her best perfume, and got ready. Naomi thought Ruth looked beautiful, and sent her off to see Boaz. Boaz had worked outside that night, and he was sleeping under the stars. Ruth crept up to him and lay down at his feet. In the middle of the night, he woke up with a start. "Who's there, sleeping by my feet?" he whispered in the dark. "It's me, Ruth. Because you're a close relative, you are responsible for taking care of me. I've come to ask if you would take me as your wife. You have always been so good to me." Boaz sat up. "Ruth," he said, "you are so lovely. Any man would be honored to make you his wife. It's true that I am a close relative, but there is a man who is a closer relative to you than I am. I'll see him tomorrow. If he will take responsibility for you, well and good. If not, then I will. Meanwhile, lie down and stay here until the morning." The next morning, Ruth went home to Naomi and told her all that had happened. She took barley home as a present from Boaz. Naomi was pleased with how things had gone. "I'm sure you will hear from Boaz today," she said. Meanwhile, Boaz went to see the closer relative of Ruth, and they agreed that Boaz would look after Ruth. When Naomi and Ruth heard this, they were overjoyed. They let all their friends know the good news. There was going to be a wedding. The wedding was a very special day, and Ruth's happiness was made complete in seeing Naomi happy once again. As the years went by, Boaz and Ruth grew to love each other very much, and they had a baby boy. They called him Obed. Naomi loved her new grandson and took care of him. When Naomi was holding the baby on her lap one day, all her old friends came by and said, "Naomi's smiling again. Ruth was better to her than 7 sons. See how the Lord has blessed them." Many years later, David, the great king of Israel, was born into Obed's family. So Ruth and Boaz, because of their loyalty and kindness, were blessed by God and became the great-grandparents of a mighty king. The people of Israel were God's special people, but sometimes they forgot about him. Then something would happen to bring them back to God. During the time when the people of Israel had no king, they again chose to forget God. Most people didn't even try to do what God wanted. At this time, there lived a man named Elkanah. Elkanah had 2 wives, as people sometimes did in those days. One had children, and the other had none. Elkanah's wife, who had no children, was called Hannah. She had long black hair and dark eyes, which lit up when she smiled. Elkanah loved Hannah very much. He liked nothing better than to make Hannah smile and laugh. But as the years went by, and Hannah still didn't have any children, she smiled less and less often. Hannah and Elkanah waited and prayed, hoping all the time that they might have a child. Elkanah's other wife was called Peninnah. Peninnah had given Elkanah many sons and daughters, but she teased Hannah and made fun of her, telling her that she was a useless wife because she couldn't give Elkanah even 1 child. Elkanah was one of the few people at that time who tried to follow the Lord. Once a year, he took the whole family to Shiloh. There the Lord's covenant box containing the 10 Commandments was kept in a holy tent. A priest took care of the covenant box and made offerings at an altar there. One year, after Elkanah had finished worshipping God at Shiloh, all his family were having a meal together. Hannah was there, and Peninnah and her children. Hannah felt sad as she saw Peninnah with all her children. It made it even worse when Peninnah started teasing her. Each year, Hannah tried not to listen to the insults of Peninnah and her children. But as time went by and she still had no baby, they became harder and harder to ignore. This time, Peninnah's teasing was more cruel than usual. "You're getting old, Hannah. Look at all my children. You don't have any. Oh, what will you do when you're really old and don't have any children to care for you?" Hannah couldn't take it anymore. She burst into tears and covered her face. She wanted a baby so much. "Why, oh, why don't I have a child?" she cried out in her heart. Elkanah saw Hannah crying. He hadn't heard what Peninnah had said, but he guessed. Peninnah was always saying spiteful things to Hannah that made her cry. Elkanah said, "Hannah, why are you crying? It's not so bad, really. Don't be upset about not having a child. It's all right. Look, our love is so special. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Elkanah didn't know that Hannah's longing for a baby was not something which would go away because she loved Elkanah. Her love for Elkanah was not any less because she wanted a child. "But it's not all right," Hannah thought. She stood up and left the table. When he saw her leave, Elkanah thought to himself, "She'll get over it in time." Hannah walked away from the family gathering, towards the altar where offerings were made to God. Her heart was heavy. She wanted a baby so much, but there was nothing more she could do. Hannah started praying silently to the Lord. She was so unbearably sad that she couldn't put it into words. Her lips moved as she prayed. The tears streamed down her face as the bitterness she felt overflowed out of her heart. "Oh, Lord," she prayed quietly, "I want a baby so badly. Please, God, if you would give me a son, I would dedicate him to you and bring him back here to be brought up by your priest. The child would be yours from the beginning. Please, God, hear my prayer." While Hannah was praying, Eli the priest sat nearby watching her. Eli saw her lips move but heard no sound. Hannah's eyes were red from crying. In those days, there weren't many people in Israel who went to Eli's tent to pray, and those who did prayed out loud. Some people who had come to Shiloh to celebrate even entered the tent while they were drunk. So when the priest saw Hannah's red eyes and saw her lips move but no sound come out, he thought she had had too much to drink. "You there," he said, "this is not the place for you to come if you are drunk." "No, sir," Hannah cried. "Please don't think I'm one of those drunken people who stumble in here during the feast. I'm a woman who is very sad. I have not been drinking. I was pouring out my troubles to God." As Eli came closer to Hannah, he could see how unhappy she was. He knew that she spoke the truth. "Go in peace," he said, "and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked of him." Hannah bowed her head. "Thank you for your blessing, sir," she said. As Hannah walked away, she felt the weight of worry and shame lift from her heart. By the time Hannah reached Elkanah, she was smiling again. The next morning, Elkanah and his family returned home. Elkanah was so pleased to see Hannah looking happier. Soon Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a boy whom she named Samuel. Hannah said she gave her son that name because she asked the Lord for him, and he heard her. The name Samuel was related to the Hebrew word ask. Hannah and Elkanah were overjoyed that the Lord had answered their prayers. While Samuel was young, Elkanah continued going up to Shiloh once a year to worship God. Hannah decided not to go with him. When Samuel was a little older, she would take him there to live with the priest, and then he would be dedicated to the Lord, as she had promised. When Samuel was 3, Hannah knew the time had come to join the family on the yearly journey to Shiloh, and take Samuel to Eli the priest. Hannah had never forgotten the promise she made to God. Samuel had been a gift from God to start with. Handing him over to Eli so that he would grow closer to God was continuing the steps she took on that day when Eli thought she was drunk. She had trusted God with her prayer for a child, and now she was trusting God to take care of her son. Elkanah and Hannah took Samuel to Eli. Hannah held Samuel's hand tightly in her own. They stood at the door of the tent in Shiloh, where the Lord was worshipped. "Eli?" Hannah called out. When the old man appeared, Hannah said, "Remember me. I am the woman whose prayers you blessed. I was praying for a baby, and look how the Lord has answered my prayers." She smiled down at Samuel. Hannah had had a long talk with Samuel, telling him how he would belong to God in a special way. He knew the priest Eli would take care of him now. And even if he wasn't too sure what that meant, Samuel wasn't afraid. His mother and father had told him God would take care of him wherever he was. Samuel trusted them, and he trusted the Lord. He knew he would see his parents when the family came to Shiloh every year. "I promised this child to God when I prayed here," Hannah continued. "And now he's old enough for you to take care of him." Eli nodded. He slowly bent down until he was looking Samuel in the eye. "Welcome, friend," he said. Samuel looked at the kind eyes of old Eli the priest, and he knew he was safe. Then they worshipped the Lord, and Hannah prayed, thanking God for how happy he had made her. As Hannah walked back home with Elkanah and Peninnah, she wasn't sad about leaving Samuel behind. He was in God's hands, and there was no better place for him to be. In time, the Lord was to bless Hannah and Elkanah with more children. They had 2 daughters and 3 more sons, in addition to Samuel. God blessed Hannah for being so faithful. Hannah knew that Samuel would grow into a man with a strong faith in God. And she was right. Samuel was happy living with Eli the priest. His mother Hannah had made a promise to God that Samuel would grow up especially dedicated to God. His mother and father had brought him to Eli now that he was 3 years old and given him to the Lord's service. Eli was good to him, just as his own father Elkanah would have been. Eli enjoyed having Samuel, as his own sons were greedy and selfish men who didn't care about God or about being priests. Samuel learned quickly and soon knew much about the history of Israel and the laws God had given his people. More important, Samuel wanted to obey God, while Eli's sons did not. Every year when Hannah and Elkanah came to Shiloh to worship the Lord, Hannah brought Samuel a new robe to wear. Samuel loved seeing his parents when they came, and the robes Hannah gave him were very special to him. They reminded him that Hannah and Elkanah loved him and thought about him. Samuel helped Eli in the temple, keeping all the lamps lit. He learnt about all the different types of offerings that could be made to God. Samuel also learnt that praying was just like talking to God. One night, while young Samuel was asleep, he heard a voice calling his name. "Samuel!" "Here I am," Samuel said. He got up and ran to Eli. "Yes, Eli, did you call me? What did you want, sir?" Samuel asked. The old man sat up in bed and scratched his beard. "I didn't call you," he said. "Lie down and go to sleep. It's the middle of the night." Samuel did as he was told. But no sooner had he fallen asleep than he heard the voice again, calling, "Samuel!" Samuel woke up and ran to Eli. "Yes, Eli," the boy said. "No, my son, I didn't call you," Eli said again. "Go back to bed." When Samuel went back to bed, he heard the voice for a third time, calling, "Samuel!" Samuel had never heard the voice of God before, and still thought it was Eli who was calling him. Once again he ran to Eli. This time, Eli realized that Samuel must have heard the Lord's voice. It had been a long time since God had spoken to any of the people of Israel. So many of them had stopped obeying his laws that holy men like Eli were afraid God had almost despaired of his people. Eli told Samuel, "It is the Lord God who is calling you. Answer him next time by saying, 'Yes, Lord, I am listening.'" The boy did as he was told, and the next time the Lord spoke to him, he said, "Yes, Lord, I'm listening." Then the Lord said to him, "I have seen the bad things Eli's sons have been doing. He was wrong not to tell them to change after I warned him to stop them. For that, I will punish his family." The next morning, Eli told Samuel to tell him everything the Lord had said. "Tell me everything and leave nothing out," Eli said. Samuel was afraid to give Eli the bad news about his sons. But when Eli heard he was to be punished for not correcting his sons, he nodded and said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what he thinks is right." When Eli and his sons had died, Samuel grew up to be an important man in Israel. During this time, their enemies, the Philistines, ruled over them. 20 years passed. During this time, the Israelites turned to God and asked him to help them. So Samuel said to them, "If you are going to follow the Lord properly, you need to change. Put away all the statues of false gods you have. Take them out of your homes and your hearts, and don't think about them anymore. Say you are sorry. Learn God's laws again and obey them. Then he will rescue you from the power of the Philistines." The people of Israel threw away all the idols and began to serve God again. They were truly sorry. "Yes, we have done wrong," they said. When Samuel saw the Israelites worshipping the true God, he asked them all to meet with him to pray. They prayed for forgiveness and made an offering, asking God to take care of them. The Philistines heard that the Israelites had all gathered together, so they went out to attack them. The Israelites were terrified and said to Samuel, "Keep praying for the Lord our God to save us from the Philistines." So Samuel kept on praying for the people. And God answered him. When the Philistines attacked, he sent thunder roaring through the skies, so that the Philistines ran away in panic, scared and confused. The Israelites chased after them and won the battle. As long as Samuel lived, he prayed for Israel to be kept safe. For many years to come, God answered those prayers and protected the people from the Philistines.